This is Judaism Unbound, episode 522. Announcement! Big Judaism Unbound news. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Lex Rofberg, and we're going a little bit out of order today. We're going to start things off with some general Judaism Unboundments, and then we'll pivot into the remainder of our episode. I won't say too much more, but we have, as the title of this episode suggests, you might have noticed when you clicked it to start playing, some big news. We have that coming up. But before we do Judaism Unboundments, we have amazing courses in the Onion Yeshiva that are starting in the near future. First, Judaism Inbound, our Intro to Judaism class for folks looking to convert to Judaism, or for anybody who wants to take an Intro to Judaism class for whatever reason you have. That begins in just a couple weeks as this episode is being released. You can sign up at judaismunbound.com/classes. We also have 4 amazing courses open to the public that you can find at judaismunbound.com/classes. There's Jews and Revolution with Tony Michaels, The Magic and Medicine of the Psalms with Shefa Gold, Every Body Beloved, A Jewish Embrace of Fatness with Minna Bromberg, and Genesis, Peoplehood and Solidarity in Bereshit, that's the Hebrew name for Genesis, with Amanda Mbuvi. There's also From Here to Ger, which is a class where you take steps towards your personal conversion rituals. That's specifically for folks who have taken Judaism Inbound with us prior. So you can learn more about all of these at judaismunbound.com/classes. Financial aid is available across the board for any of our classes. Another quick unbouncement, and then we'll be fully off to the races with the news. We've got Shabbat Unbound happening tonight. I say tonight for the day this episode is being released, Friday, February 13th. If you're listening to this episode after February 13th, that means you did miss the live session of our Shabbat Unbound gathering, diving into the prayer Ahavat Olam, all about love. But if you would like to sign up for future Shabbat Unbound gatherings, including one on March 13th, you can do so at judaismunbound.com/Shabbat. If you are listening on February 13th, go to that same link and sign up so that you can attend tonight. Next, we are going to turn towards the question at hand, this big Unbound Jewish Judaism Unbound news that we are breaking today. I'm not going to be the one to make that news public. That will be our very own Dan Liebenson. So Dan, I'm going to pass things over to you. What's this news we've got to share with the world?
I kind of have a framing that there are 3 pieces of news. The third one, which is the news that we're really talking about today, but of note, I would say that number 1, Judaism Unbound is going to celebrate its 10th anniversary in about a month. And number 2 is that I think, Lex, we haven't actually talked about this, but I think this is probably true. And sorry if I'm stealing any of your thunder to announce this, but I think we're at about 3 million downloads of Judaism Unbound, which I think is very cool.
That is true.
I'm very excited about that. And the third piece of news, which is really the one that we're here to talk about today, is that 10 years is a long time to be doing one thing, and for all kinds of reasons, including that for the last 3 years, I've had a big job that is taking a lot of my time, that we've decided that it makes sense for me to give up my co-hosting duties of Judaism Unbound and hand them over to someone else. And I will still be coming back to do a little bit of Judaism Unbound stuff, but I'm not going to be the voice that you hear every Friday. And that's big news for us.
It is very big news for us, and it's, I don't even want to say bittersweet. It's mostly bitter sad news. Like, we love Dan Liebenson. We love what you have brought to this podcast for those 10 years. Everything we do wouldn't exist without you, and we won't ever forget that. And so this is a challenging moment for us because for the entirety of this show and this organization, Dan and Lex has been like almost a 1-syllable word. It's 3 syllables, but like it's been what a lot of people think of as a phrase for this podcast and who its voices are. We are excited in many ways organizationally about growing beyond just our 2 voices, but it will always be the case that you were our first. And so we have incredible gratitude to you. We're going to say more about this in a little bit. And by the way, I'm saying we, and to a savvy listener that might be confusing, if there are only 2 voices here, which you could think that based on the conversation so far. There is a third voice in this room. There is another. I'm citing Star Wars in honor of Dan Liebenson, a very big Star Wars fan.
Thank you.
There is somebody else who we're introducing today, and I'm thrilled to say who that somebody is. Rini Yehuda Newman is going to be the new co-host of Judaism Unbound. I hope if you're on the subway, if you're in a car, if you're in your kitchen, wherever you are, you make a literal out loud noise, woo, for Rini Yehuda Newman. This is very exciting news for us. Rini Yehuda Newman, I won't say too much because they're going to introduce themselves, but they are a new old face. I'm quoting the name of the old new synagogue in Prague where the Golem lives. But Rini Yehuda is an old new voice, an old new face for Judaism Unbound. They are part of our staff. They have been part of this podcast for the last number of years. But Rini Yehuda Newman is our new co-host of Judaism Unbound with me. And so I'll pass it over to you, Rini Yehuda Newman, to introduce yourself a little bit.
Lex and Dan, it is such an honor to get to be in this position, stepping into this role as co-host, and to feel that I'm getting to inherit the incredible legacy, Dan, of this podcast that you've worked on for the last decade. My name is Rini Yehuda. To all those listening out there who have not yet met me, I am a comics artist and a storyteller. I am an educator and an independent publisher, super passionate about Jewish communal memory and storytelling. There are so many ways in which I'm thrilled about the opportunity to get to step into a role where we'll be interviewing people, telling all kinds of Jewish stories from across the digital diaspora. And my work with the Unyeshiva certificate program has really launched me into a place where I couldn't be more excited to get to be integrated into the Unbound universe in this capacity. It's really such an honor after this last decade of truly incredible interviews and unbinding of Judaisms. I am really, really excited to get to have this time with both of you as this transition happens, to really reflect on what the last 10 years have been, thinking about this incredible decade archive of Judaism Unbound interviews that the both of you have done together, and to get to inherit this past torch from you, Dan. I'm really looking forward to all the things to come and to really honor the things that have come before.
This kind of feels like a relay race where, I always sort of wonder, I don't know the rules of relay races, but, there's a period of time where they run together with the baton.
Wait, we talked about this with Brent Spodek. Keep going, but I do know the rules of relay races.
I'm just never clear on if there's a rule about like when you have to drop the baton if you're I'm sure there is.
Yes, there's an exchange zone.
Yeah, so we're like in the exchange zone right now because this is cool. My question was, how is this working? Like, are you you talked about inheriting, Rini Yehuda, like, are you inheriting my role, or is Lex inheriting my role and you're inheriting Lex's role, or it's something completely different?
Ooh, it's a shifting down of 2x2s. But I feel like what's cool about this moment is that instead of the Judaism Unbound podcast being sort of this static motion, we're actually inventing what is the tradition that comes out of this moment. So much of Judaism Unbound from its inception was about this idea that Judaism is this thing that's ever changing. And instead of it just being something that's like a passive inheritance, we actually really get to build out what we want for the future project that is Judaism. And this is a really cool moment because it feels like it's living that transition. It's living this framework about like, we got to go beyond the institutions, or that the institutions get created. And then suddenly we're creating something new based on the framework that we inherited to begin with. And in this moment that we're all holding the baton together, this is a moment that we're getting to define what we want that direction of building to look like.
I love that. And also it's just like, it's something that I remember thinking about in the early days of Judaism Unbound. And it's something that B'nai, Lappy, and I have talked about. Like, when you create something new that is meant to be unbinding, that's meant to be pushing against the orthodoxy of what you've inherited, is it inevitable that the thing that you create then develops an orthodoxy of its own and starts to say, this is not how we do things here, or this is what you have to do in order to. And on the one hand, like, I've always felt really committed to not building that. And on the other hand, I've never really had a theory of how to not build that. And I guess like maybe when there's a founder that's still involved, maybe that's part of the answer, that as long as the founder maintains a certain founding mentality, they can stave off that kind of move to an orthodoxy. And Lex is a co-founder of the podcast. And so in a way, like, we're not at that moment where the founder's gone. But it's interesting to think about that exchange zone as an opportunity to do better than maybe we often do, and make sure that you have a process of sharing and then ultimately leaving something to the next generation without it hardening into that thing that the founder that we all remember, this is what they wanted. This is what we're going to keep doing, even if it doesn't work anymore.
Yeah, I agree. I have strong thoughts about that as somebody in a Jewish movement, Jewish renewal, that has a prominent founder, Zalman Schachter Shalomi. There's all these debates about what happens when the founder is not there. And you could go to other movements, Reconstructionism, Mordechai Kaplan, what happens? Like, this is a tried and true Jewish conversation. I wanted to hop to a couple little metaphors that the two of you just brought to mind for me. One is in talking about Jewish continuity and Jewish discontinuity, which has been a passion of mine the last few years. I've brought forth this parable of the ship of Theseus a number of times, and I think I've talked about it with both of you, maybe publicly already with both of you separately. But the ship of Theseus is this notion that, okay, you have a ship, and it's got all its different parts. It's got its every single plank that's a part of it. It's got the wheel that steers. It's got the mast. I don't know enough about ships to say all the different parts, but what is it? Bow, stern, starboard, port. There we go. And a plank breaks, and so you replace that plank. And in the parable in its first version, I believe the idea is that you replace the old plank with a new plank that is effectively the same in every respect. But there's a plank that replaces the old plank, and then it happens again. The second plank gets replaced, and then other parts of the ship get replaced. And after a long period of time, every single plank on the ship has been replaced with a part that was not part of it at the beginning. And the question of the parable is this still the ship of Theseus? Or is it a new thing? And we're not going to answer. But what's happening right now is there is an act happening where a part of the ship is being replaced. I don't think the new part of the ship is identical to the previous. I don't think Rini Yehuda and Dan are identical. I do think there are elements of how you think about the Jewish world that do actually overlap. I think there's other things that are distinct. But I'm excited with Rini Yehuda and with our community to figure out what it will be. And the other thing, and then I will stop my rambling, when we talk about new roles, I was thinking about the verb role, R-O-L-L. And specifically at Shabbat Unbound recently, we spoke about the prayer Ma'ariv Aravim, which has a section that's often translated, God who rolls light into darkness and rolls darkness into light. This rolling from one into the next, which is an interesting verb to use for the transition between day and night and day. I think we're rolling. And I'm using that as R-O-L-E-I-N-G, like we're in the process of learning what the new roles of Rini Yehuda and Lex are. There's practical things. Listeners, I don't even know which one of us will be the intros most weeks, which one of us will be the outros most weeks. Dan and I have had a rhythm with that. It might be the same, might be different. We are rolling, R-O-L-E, and we're also rolling, R-O-L-L, as we move into this new period.
I just want to add one of the things that I'm thinking about with the ship of Theseus is somebody has to replace the planks. There's a person who's making those decisions to put in the pieces that are exactly alike, that are the same model, or putting in, a totally new, beautiful cedar finish, right? That there's somebody who's making these decisions about exactly what those things are. And one of the things that we can build out from the analogy about the ship of Theseus is about stewardship. One of the things that's been so cool about Judaism Unbound has been the way that you both have been stewards of this idea of going beyond Jewish institutions. And for the last 10 years, you've created this incredible archive of Jewish thinkers and doers and creatives who are thinking about what does it mean to build out a creative and innovative Judaism from so many different angles. This is a really interesting moment of stewardship. How are we passing this idea of exploding what Jewish life can be between different generations? There aren't actually a whole lot of spaces in the Jewish world where we have really thoughtful conversations across different generations of Jews. I feel like shul is one of the places that often happens the most, but I'm really interested about the fact that there are 3 different generations of Jewish thinkers on this podcast right now, and I'm now becoming a steward of that idea as well. So I'm appreciating the intergenerationality of that and thinking about what does it mean to guide this idea or this Torah of building innovative, unbound Judaism from one generation to the next. And then wondering what do we do from this place of the 3 of us deciding how this tradition moves forward into 3 people 10 years from now, or maybe 50 years from now. I don't know if we'll be doing audio by then. I wonder what the medium will be.
It's really interesting. But first of all, by the way, I just wanted to mention one thing that I think I didn't mention, which was that this is not my last episode. I'm still on for a couple more weeks until our 10th anniversary, more or less. So just FYI, don't be surprised that you're going to hear me next week and it's going to sound like nothing happened. The other thing that I wanted to note, though, about what you're saying, Rini, is like one of the pieces that I was very conscious of when we started the podcast and have been conscious of over the whole last 10 years is that there was an older generation than me that is not one of the co-hosts. And part of the role that at least I had in my head, I don't know, Lex, I don't think we ever really talked about this, but being conscious of that generation or those generations of potential listeners and making sure that whatever we were talking about that might be, generally speaking, what a lot of young people are doing was legible to people that were older and that didn't only sound like rebellion or, we don't care. One of the most poignant Talmud texts that I really love is the famous text of the Oven of Achnai, which is often studied as this text about how we don't have to listen to God. People can think for themselves. If the majority wants something different than what's written in the Torah, what seems to be written in the Torah, then you go with the majority. And then, God is asked how God thinks about this, and God laughs and says, "My children have defeated me." And most people end the story there. But that's not where the story ends. The story actually goes on that they end up excommunicating the Rabbi Eliezer, who was arguing for the other position. And he is ultimately so hurt and so abandoned by this innovation that has now excommunicated him, made him out of it, that he, in his hurt, ends up accidentally killing Rabban Gamliel, who's the sort of head of the center that's doing this innovation, right? And my read on that story is, yes, you should innovate and you should embrace the innovation and be unbound. And at the same time, be careful not to make the older generation feel like they can't be part of it or that they're being disrespected. And so there's a piece of me that was always kind of conscious in saying, I want listeners that are of an older generation that might not be completely on board with what we're talking about, might not completely understand it. I want them to listen to this podcast and say, that was really interesting. Like, I learned something. I got something out of that. I didn't feel bad listening to that podcast. And I don't know if we've always succeeded with that or not, but that was always in my head. I didn't feel the same need to do that for the younger generation because, at least when we started, Lex was extremely young. And so it was kind of like we covered that. Of course, there were also younger people, but I sort of suppose that they mostly didn't listen to podcasts. Although, by the way, we were always really excited when we found out someone like you, Rini Yehuda, who actually was a college student and was listening to the podcast. So I was conscious of that a little. I think Lex was conscious of that a lot. Anyway, I think that that's one question, right? Like as we transition now, on the one hand, Lex is now 10 years older. So I don't know, like Lex, how you think about that, but it's also interesting just to think about how you all will now kind of mind that part of the store.
Yeah. From our first episode, if I remember right, it was either the first episode or second, but I think the first, this theme of intergenerational conversation has been front and center. And you're right. Like, it's funny, Dan, you and me, like the distance between our ages has not changed, right?
Right.
I don't know the precise number of years.
I think it's 20 years.
Yeah, it's around 20. Like, I am if we're doing a difference question mathematically, that's the same. But there is a way in which the life stage, if we were doing a ratio, the ratio between me as a 25-year-old and you in your mid-40s is, I don't know, it's a smaller number than the ratio of me as a 35-year-old and you in your mid-50s. And so there is a way in which whatever it is that we were gaining early on in our show from being different generations, we might have been gaining less of it recently. I am really jazzed that we are expanding our bounds, pun intended, to another new generation. And I also feel called to bring in the wisdom of Arthur Waskow, who is, I think, actually probably one of our couple oldest guests ever, who is really interested in quoting the text from the prophets about elders turning to youths and youths turning to elders. I really believe that whatever is changing about Judaism Unbound in this transition period, and there's a lot, one of the things that is going to remain is the care we try to put in to intergenerational conversation. We believe that serves the Jewish world and the broader world, as Rini Yehuda said, in a world that actually does not make it easy for people to be connected across generations. Like even the three of us are actually a small subsection of all of the world's ages, right? And so it will continue to be the case that we enter into conversation with folks much older than us and in conversation with folks younger than us. That is part of the identity of this work. So I always think of Arthur Waskow when that comes up, because he is an elder who so deeply valued the voices of young folks. And you're right, that's something we need to continue to cherish in the other direction as well.
Very cool to get to be part of a moment in which, as an organization, we get to model what that looks like, the element of intergenerationality. And Dan, what you're really highlighting about the tension that's been recognized literally since the Tannaitic period, the period that the Talmud was being written, the first sages, of the tension between the old guard and the new guard, or the old and the young. And that it's a very productive tension when it's able to be held with honor and respect in a way that goes both ways. And I feel like American culture really struggles with that. There's an odd glorification of youth. I don't feel like we treat elders particularly well in American culture. It's really cool to have an opportunity to think really intentionally about, if we're serious about building and dreaming the Jewish future, we can really talk and think about intergenerationality in a way that is so much more productive and so much more beautiful, in a way that really allows all of the gifts that come from a variety of different age-based experiences to be really front and center about what does it mean to build the next Jewish future, or the unbound Jewish future. I want to go back to think about some of the earliest encounters that I had as a college student seeing Judaism Unbound get started. I remember seeing the first episodes coming out and seeing the phrase, "Oh, Judaism Unbound, that sounds interesting to me." And I was a freshman or a sophomore at University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I remember I was trying to get my feet wet in Jewish life, and just none of the offerings were very interesting to me. There were the sort of like Hillel being Jewish 101 classes. I ended up having a very meaningful relationship with my campus Chabad. But when I thought about the kind of Jewish conversations that I really wanted, listening to the Judaism Unbound podcast, it felt like the clouds were opening up. And suddenly, here were these two thinkers who were really pushing an innovative idea about what Judaism is, was, and could be. And as we were preparing for this episode, I went back into my emails from a decade ago, and I found emails that I sent to Lex and Dan saying, "Hey, I want to start an Unbound Jewish club at my university." And I pitched the idea to Hillel, and they didn't seem very interested. But every time I talked to other Jewish students about it, they seemed to really want to be in. What do you think of that? And I remember hearing back from Dan saying, "Hey, this sounds like a great idea. We're here to help if there are any ways that we can support you with materials. We're more than happy to have you talking about our podcast episodes or talking about these unbound Jewish ideas everywhere you can."
But we have no budget to send you any money.
But we have no budget to send you any money. So you will do it on with truly your own chutzpah, with truly your own daring, audacious energy. But I remember it really gave me hope that there was more than just me who wanted something more from the Judaism that I was being offered. And from there, I mean, Dan, the way that with the Judaism Unbound title and with your like very intense passion about guarding the notion that we can have a Judaism that expands beyond the institutions we've inherited, that gave me so much hope as I was stepping into an adult Judaism, that there were more people who were thinking about that, and that my dissatisfaction with the Judaism I had inherited didn't have to be something that made me an outsider, but actually just made me part of not only a new movement, but part of a real intergenerational history of Jews who are always expanding and innovating and renovating what Judaism is and does. Dan, I really chalk that up to the vision that you had for this organization and you had for this podcast, of being so serious about that, and sometimes even suggesting ideas for the Jewish future that I was like, whoa, that feels out of bounds with what I want, right? That it was great to have the experience of somebody who was older than me, who was suggesting things that felt like they exploded an idea of Judaism in a way that I thought was extreme. That was fantastic. It was so refreshing. And it made me feel so much less alone at a time that maybe I would have actually just rejected Judaism altogether. Or it would have been a harder route to not feel that there were other people who were making serious inroads and talking about this in such a public way. So I have such gratitude for that aspect of what I inherited from the Judaism Unbound podcast from like day one. and how amazing it is to 10 years later get to really reflect on what an amazing archive that is as we do this passing of the baton in the, what was the zone called?
Exchange zone.
To be in the exchange zone here with both of you together.
I love that with the two of you, it seems a sports metaphor has won the day for how we're talking about this. The exchange zone, I'm a big fan of relay races, and truly, folks who want to hear more, listen to the Brent Spodek episode. We'll put it in the show notes. Dan, I kind of want to direct to you a question that you and I both have been directing to some of our early guests when we've had them return to the podcast. We had an episode last week with Juan Mejia, other previous episodes with Barbara Tita, Benet Lappi, and we've been asking them to sit with what has shifted over the course of 10 years, and to what degree does that show in Judaism Unbound's work itself? We've been asking them as sort of outside gaze to direct that gaze at us over a 10-year period. But now I want to ask you, as somebody who has been deeply inside our gaze, what has shifted in the past 10 years on a general level that feels relevant, and also on a Judaism Unbound specific level? And I will say to listeners, if you like what Dan has to say on this now, stay tuned for a future episode in about a month where there will be really a lot more of this.
Well, first of all, just one comment about what you just said, Rina Yehuda. It's funny, as you were saying that some of the things that I said were even too extreme for you. I remember times when, we've been friends for a long time and in touch for a long time over the course of your life over the last 10 years and how you've changed. And there were times when I was like, why does Rina Yehuda have to be so, traditionally religious or whatever, which is like, why is Rina Yehuda attracted to Chabad or to these things? And you're in great company, because I think I've told this story before, but when I first met Benet Lappi, I was a Hillel director, and she came and gave this amazing, talk, her crash talk. I don't remember what it was, but she was talking about how she observes Shabbat or this or that, and it came off as very standard to me, very quote unquote frum, traditional. And I was like, I don't get it. Why is she thinking so out of the ordinary, and yet her practice is kind of pretty traditional? And I don't know what your observance is, but I mean, it's just cool to have you here co-hosting Judaism Unbound and articulating its mission in such a clear and passionate way. I'm like, yeah, you're here. It's so exciting. And I'm picking up on an interesting language that you've been using, Rina Yehuda, sort of describing me. And I'm thinking, how does that land? And how does that land on me now versus how does it land on me 10 years ago? And you've said something like, it's kind of, I don't remember exactly the language that you said, but that it's about not having to do the old institutions. And the way that lands on me now is that, to me, it's not about institutions or not institutions, but it is about the freedom of somebody to think for themselves. A person who thinks for themselves can still get amazing things from an institution. I think maybe it's more anti-authority. I'm all in favor of institutions. I'm all in favor of, I get the value of large organizations, that they can do certain things that smaller organizations can't do. What I don't like is when they say this is the right way to do it. This is the only proper way to do it. If they're going to say that, then I want to empower people to go to those institutions, take whatever they have to offer, but not get sucked into that mindset that says, they say this is the only way to do it, and I guess it is. And then I have to say either I like it and I like it enough that I'm going to be part of it, or I don't like it, and so I'm going to have to leave it. When I took this job as the president of a foundation 3 years ago, some people, not that many people, but some people said to me some kind of version of, well, now you're joining the mainstream. And I was like, that's not how I experience this at all. To the extent that I'm involved with the mainstream, which I am, definitely, much more so than the 7 years before, I feel like I'm trying to change the mainstream. And I'm trying to change the mainstream in two ways. One is that I'm trying to change what it's doing so that it's better. But the other, and I think more important, is that I'm trying to send the message, don't say there's only one way to do this. Stop signaling that. You can do whatever you want, but offer it the way an artist offers art, which is that if you love it, great. If you like it, fine. And if you don't like it, also fine. And the artist doesn't say, I'm going to shake you until you like my art. And by the way, just in my continued self-defense here, I also spend a lot of time outside the mainstream in my current job, and so I feel like I've got this vantage point, but also this opportunity to try to influence people that may not listen to a podcast called Judaism Unbound. And that's a place where my perspective has changed. But it's a really good question as to, how things have shifted. I think that the founding myth, at least, of Judaism Unbound was that I had in mind that I could write a book with Lex's help. I mean, I'd hired Lex early on to be more or less of a research assistant on this imagined book. But the book that I imagined was going to be something that said there's a movement already going on, a kind of a nascent movement of a reimagination of Judaism. And if we could find out all the information about that movement and what's working and what's not working and what ideas there are, and we could kind of collect it together in a book, then people could read that book and that would give them the juice that they needed to actually turn that into a movement. Then I don't like writing that much, and so it sort of turned into a podcast, and it was a whole different thing. But I think that in my mind, that was still the notion over the first couple of years of Judaism Unbound, that somehow we were finding out about something that's out there, that's nascent, and hoping to do something to gel it into something that the parts would understand that they're actually part of something bigger. Actually, I think that's still exactly what I'm trying to do. What I realized over those 10 years is that it's not enough to just hope that people will hear something and act, that's not people's natural inclination, and that there's a need to actually make that thing happen. And I think that two things happened over the course of the last 10 years that contributed to that. One is that Judaism Unbound started doing things besides the podcast. And some of that was intentional and some of that was opportunistic. And I think that even more of that has happened over the last 3 years since I handed off the organizational leadership of Judaism Unbound to Miriam Turlinchamp. I think that Judaism Unbound added much more than analytics to its work, is actually making stuff happen. And then the other piece of it is that I took this position at Living Camphor Foundation for Living Torah because I felt that with financial resources and other things that financial resources allows one to put into place, like a staff team that's larger, you would be able to accelerate the development of that movement in ways that I think are a lot harder for a small startup to do. So that the jury's out on whether that's actually going to happen. I firmly believe that it will. But I definitely think that where I've ended up is saying that these things don't happen naturally. Even if there's a nascent movement out there where there is a lot of alignment among the people, they're probably not going to come together and build something greater than the sum of its parts on their own. They're going to need some kind of catalyst that's intentionally trying to make that happen.
Dan, I want to go back to some of the things that you were saying about going from being anti-institutional to actually zooming out towards something that's less about being against the institutions, but more about the idea of lo bashamayim hi, this famous phrase that means the Torah is not in heaven, that it's very near to us. And there isn't just one right way to do it, that so many different people have an answer that can also be the answer, and that these things aren't mutually exclusive. These things don't contradict. I'm wondering, when I was a youth and hearing the beginning of the Judaism Unbound podcast, of course, being in college is exactly the time that you're supposed to be critiquing the world and, seeing all the things that are wrong. And so the lens being, or perhaps my perception of the lens being anti-institutional, saying, down with the status quo, down with the things that have been. It's cool to hear this articulation of whether or not that's my perception of the podcast that's changed. Your thinking has changed or evolved on it to be not just against what something is, but actually a much more positive vision. A Judaism that traverses denominations, that traverses boundaries and borders and dogmas. I love what you said about artists. And part of what makes art is the fact that it means multiple things to multiple people, that there is no one fixed meaning. And frankly, any art that insists on only one meaning is probably quite bad art. So the idea that Judaism gets to be a religion or something beyond a religion of art and artists is the idea that one piece or one idea or one ritual or one concept or practice doesn't have to stay in one movement or one denomination or one ideological space, but actually the best parts of Judaism speak to people who might otherwise have nothing in common in terms of their practice, except for an orientation towards a Judaism that can be more and more expansive.
I want to really hold that and also pivot to the part of this conversation that'll make Dan most uncomfortable and is therefore the most fun, which is articulating some of your superpowers. You know, and many of our listeners know that one of my go-to questions that I ask many people who run organizations is like, what are the superpowers of your organization? Or even on an individual level, like, what are some of your superpowers in the sense of gifts? Like, it's not just to make people feel good. It's also because in articulating precisely what the incredible gifts, superpowers, etc. of an organization or a person are, they allow us to strive towards them, aspire towards them for other people, for other organizations. And so you talk about, more than one way to be Jewish. That said a lot. And I have like a little bit of a, not from the two of you, but from some people, a little bit of a trigger response to people who are like pluralism and more than one way to be Jewish. Because I think for a lot of people, they mean like 6 ways. I mean, I'm making up a number, but they mean like, yeah, there's more than one way, but like we can still point at some of the ways. And if you ask them like, well, but what about, Karaite Judaism? I mean, I'm picking like the most off the beaten path. Like, what about the Beta Israel Jews in Ethiopia? What about the Amei Haaretz, the people that the rabbis looked at and said they don't know anything, their Judaism's terrible, all over the Talmud? What about the villains of the Torah? These are all categories of kinds of Jews that you and I have dove into very deeply, because when I initially spoke to you and what drew me to you in the first place was that it was very clear to me that when you said there's more than one way to be Jewish, you kind of meant there's infinite ways to be Jewish. Or at the very least, we have to lean into the ways that feel most close to, is that really Judaism? Like we have to go into conversation about the kinds of Jewish that feel most questionable, that feel most on the edge, that feel most like, well, do we really count that if we're going to achieve anything for quote unquote mainstream Judaism, but even for Judaism as a collective project beyond just mainstream? I'm struck by how many interests of mine or passions of mine that are not yours, you've been like, yeah, we're going to dwell in that for a long time and 12 episodes. I mentioned sports stuff. Like, you came to multiple of my Limud sessions early on at the Jewish learning festivals where I talked about sports as a religious practice, etc. And you literally said to me like, Lex, I don't really care about like this is fine, but I see that there are other people in the room that this is really resonating for, and so I'm really glad you're doing this presentation. And you've encouraged me from the get-go to bring my natural fondness for sports metaphors and sports thinking into our work. Art and artists, you have talked about yourself not as being sort of a visual art or artist. I think you've maybe moved on that over the past 10 years. You could say that better than me, but like a lot of artists look at you and me and push us to think of what we do as a kind of art. And I think I've shifted on that over 10 years. I think that what we do with Judaism, as you have said many times, is treat Judaism as the paint, as the medium of art, and then try to do as much graffiti as possible. I mean, a mixture of graffiti and some like classic impressionism. I don't know, we do both. You've pushed even in directions like spirituality. Early on, that was very much an allergy of yours. And I remember many conversations where like, spirituality is not my thing. And you very excitedly welcomed people onto the show for whom spirituality is not only something they like, but like the full prism through which they understand their Jewish practice. My love of spending time in like Jewish studies circles and going to those conferences, like I think you do have a natural inclination towards some of those kinds of folks. We've talked about your connection to biblical scholarship and how that kind of saved your relationship to Judaism. But there are other realms of that world that are not your speed. And you've still put like, I'm giving many examples because you mean it when you say there's more than one way to be Jewish. You live it. You have, with all of these guests we've had and with me, you have proven that when you have a response of, oh, this isn't my thing, my Dan Liebenson's thing, that is not the shutdown of the conversation. That is the beginning of the conversation. You bring an energy, you bring an excitement specifically, davka, around the Jewish stuff and broader stuff that isn't up your alley because you're like, oh, that's actually that's a superpower I don't have. And so if I'm going to be part of the Avengers with a bunch of different kinds of people, and I'm one thing with one superpower, I need the people with the art and artist superpower, like in a classic art sense. I need the people with the sports fandom. I need the people with the spirituality. I need the people with the Jewish studies scholarship beyond just Bible. Like, I can't express enough how thoroughly that modeling has affected me. It's affirmed me and empowered me personally. But it's also been something I get to observe you do to others. And I really do think it's rare. And I'm saying all this, not just to be nice to you, that is part of it, but because I want very badly for us in the future of this show to have a sense of what were your superpowers when you were the host/co-host. And so that we can make sure that even if we don't do it in exactly the way you do, we are at least striving towards doing the same. And I hope that we can really live in, Rini Yehuda and I, to that same active excitement about Davka, specifically that which is not our realm of Torah.
I want to jump in here also because, Dan, I don't want you to respond yet. I want you to just receive the, however uncomfortable it might be for the compliments. The ways in which this particular thing that Lex is pinpointing, the way that you see something that is not your Judaism, and instead of saying that's not Judaism, you say that's so exciting, Judaism is even bigger than I had known before. That attitude of like a true expansive notion about what it is to be Jewish, wanting people to push the boundaries in every single direction. I want to highlight what that does in a way that echoes outwards. It's so cool to hear the ways that that's impacted Lex. And I feel that that attitude has deeply impacted me. But from a standpoint of somebody who directs the certificate program of the Yeshiva, I see that attitude directly impacting the lives of our students in a way that is completely transformative. The idea that there are so many different ways to be Jewish, and the idea that truly in order to have the best possible Jewish future, we have to let 1,000 blossoms bloom, is such a central idea about what it is to create these communities of unbound Jews. It gives permission to have people ask really radical questions and not feel like they're an apikoros, not to feel like they're just doing it from a place of rebellion, but from a place of strength in being rooted in the tradition itself. And one of the things that I think is also, Dan, one of your superpowers is that it's not just about let's be really radical for being radical's sake. It's let's ground this in something that's really thoughtful. Let's make sure that there's a really deep, passionate conversation that connects outwards in all kinds of different ways. We can talk about it from an academic standpoint. We can talk about it from an intellectual standpoint. We can talk about it from a Jewish wisdom standpoint. But let's make sure that we incorporate as many different ways of talking about these ideas as possible. It's a willingness and a desire to be radical that comes from a place of deep thought and reflection. That's a thing that I think has really impacted me as a thinker and impacts me as a teacher or a facilitator in these spaces where my job is to help people develop their own systems of Jewish thinking. We're always encouraging our students to think big and as outside of the box as they can about what it is to be Jewish. But it's not just about, like how radical can you be? How beyond the pale can you be? How out of bounds can you be? But how much can you actually tie it and root it back into something that involves lots of reflection, lots of fantastic conversation, connecting with other people, all kinds of different intellectual and spiritual traditions, that it's really about being grounded. And it gives permission to people. It allows people to have the self-confidence and the to quote Jericho Vincent here, the holy chutzpah, the sacred chutzpah, to be able to say, this is a Judaism that is mine. And this is a Judaism that is connected to a broader Jewish future that I'm working to create. And instead of feeling isolated, it actually brings people closer together. And that feels like that's the ikar, that's the essence of Unbound Judaism. That is so much the seed that you've planted through your role as a public intellectual in the Judaism Unbound podcast. It's just such a machaye, like it's such a savior, such a wonderful thing to have as somebody who gets to inherit this role and as somebody who is inheriting a Jewish future that's being built.
I mean, I really appreciate all of that. It's I've thought this before, and I know this is a cliche, but I've always, been like, well, I'm curious, what are people going to say at my funeral? So it's nice to get a little bit of a taste of that. It's interesting too, because it gives me another level of reflection on like why it's both good for me to hand off this role to you, Rina Yehuda, or to Lex, and then Lex's role to you. However, but or for me to move on from hosting the podcast, and also for me to be doing what I'm doing now, because everything that you said, everything that both of you said, I affirm, and I continue to believe those things. And that goes to that anti-institutional question or whatever, right? Like the thing that I am objecting to from institutions classically is that they tell you that if you don't do the thing that we are doing our way, it's not great. And they tell you that sometimes overtly and sometimes not overtly or not even intentionally, but they're kind of like, this is the right way to do it. That's the element of institutions that I push back against. But the piece that I think that this is consistent in what I've always said, that on the one hand, I want to say that whatever anybody does is okay if it's not harming somebody. In other words, people shouldn't tell you that your way of doing Jewish is somehow wrong. And it's exactly like you've been saying, Lex. It's like, and my impulse is to say, if it doesn't land well on me, I want to learn more about it. Maybe I'll discover that actually, not only is it not wrong, there's something really right in it. I deeply affirm all of that. And at the same time, I've always been driven by a hope that one day we'll find something that really works for a lot of people. And that doesn't mean that after that point, then it closes down and it's the only right way to do it and everybody who's doing something else is wrong. I always want the expansiveness, but I also have always dreamed that there's a version of Judaism that could exist that would be deeply compelling. And I feel like that's the project that I'm really excited to personally work on for the next iteration of my professional life. I'm excited to both like affirm and of course with a lot of humility, but to like affirm that what you're describing is what I have believed and continue to believe, and also recognize that like, yeah, actually, like you're saying this better than me, and you should pick this up.
We will. I want to model what is a key element of this transitional moment, which we've named this implicitly or maybe explicitly, but quickly. This is not only about Dan is no longer co-hosting Judaism Unbound, Rina Yehuda is. This is also part of a broader moment for us organizationally where we're really trying to both say in words and live with our actions the fact that Judaism Unbound is not just the people in this room. It's not just the people on our staff. It's not even just the people that actively enroll in our classes. But at the very least, we want to make it clear that those people are more than just listeners of Judaism Unbound, more than just students of this organization. What I want to say to all of you out there is we need your help. We are excited in this tenure moment, in this baton pass moment, exchange zone moment, to learn from you and with you what's happening. I don't think the full truth of what is transforming, what's rolling from light to darkness, darkness to light, what's rolling, ROLE, I don't think the fullness of what is in the midst of occurring for us organizationally is going to be named and understood by the three of us. We need your voices. And so I would really love to put a call out there. This is not the close of our show. We have more to say, but I'll say this again at the close of our show. Like, we want to receive your emails. We want to see your comments in our Discord. We want to get language for what is happening with Judaism Unbound right now, in your words, in your sense. And the starting point of that, a starting point of that, will be articulating what Judaism Unbound has been for the past 10 years with Dan aboard, what Dan's voice has meant for you, what he has helped inspire and empower for you. And I really want to say it before just the outro, before just the end of the episode, that we are ready and excited to hear that from you and for you to be our Rebbes. I hope that as you hear me and Rina Yehuda reflect on Dan's superpowers and Dan about them himself, that you can also think back on your experiences with Dan in this podcast, in his on yeshiva classes he's taught, in Shavuot live sessions he's led, in the oral Talmud, all of those pieces, and articulate in real words, written down or out loud, what that has been and how Judaism Unbound might strive to continue to actualize that. So my hope is that the three of us together can actually name the ways in which we are only part of this story. We are only part of the transitional moment that is happening in this handoff. There's a handoff happening from one relay runner to the next, but also from one relay runner or multiple to an entire multiverse of Unbounders.
And I got a question for you.
Sure. Shoot.
As I've been conceptualizing the future of this podcast and this 10-year decade marker of having made Judaism Unbound, I'm really passionate about archives. I love thinking about what does it mean to keep different materials from different periods of time and to really be able to not just put them in a box on a shelf somewhere, but to really have them be something that integrates into the way that future thinkers are thinking about this period of time, to have these archival materials really inform how we think about not just the present, but the future. I wanted to ask, how do you hope that the archive of this decade of Judaism Unbound podcasts with you and Lex will be stewarded or used for the quote unquote next Jewish future?
It's such an interesting question. Like I've thought about this over time in different ways. Like I remember being on some kind of working session. I don't remember exactly what it was, but it was Jewish librarians. It was, librarians of Jewish archives of various kinds. And I don't remember why I was invited to be in this, but anyway, I was kind of a fly on the wall for most of the time for this conversation. And they were all talking about how to archive materials and particularly digital materials. I think this was during COVID. And I remember piping up at one point and saying, what if we are just living in a time that's not going to be archived? Let's just imagine that. And I was thinking about the wilderness period, or the Babylonian exile is maybe a better example, where if you ask somebody, what did the Jews do in the Babylonian exile? Most people don't know. I mean, like academics, there's no records. There's a couple of things that you can see, but basically we have no idea what they were doing. Yet we have some documents that they produced, like some books of the Bible, but they're not about, or they're certainly not directly about the experience of the Jews in Babylon. They might be allegories or something like that, and I think they probably are, but they set themselves in some earlier time in history and don't explicitly say that they're about the experience of the Jews in Babylon. And yet we know that in all kinds of ways, that was one of the most important times of the invention of Judaism and the reinvention of Judaism after the destruction of the temple. So something must have happened there, but we don't know what they were, but we do know what they produced. The truth is that I'm more interested in the legacy of Judaism Unbound being a Judaism or Judaisms that come out on the other end of it, that are thriving, that are helping people, that are built to respond to the needs that people have in this time and the future, than I am in the question of, will people remember these conversations and will people ever access these conversations? I mean, obviously there's an ego dimension that says, yeah, I hope I am remembered. We made a book, so there's not nothing. But I'm really interested to hear what you think, because, that's really going to matter a lot more than what I think. Like what you're going to do with this stuff, or what the next generation is going to do with this stuff. They're not going to do what I say they should do. They're going to do what they think they should do. And so I'm actually kind of curious. Like, what do you think we should do?
It's funny. I don't have the answer right now, but I'm interested really in the fact that your answer is more like you want Judaism Unbound to be the hand inside of a handprint, where it's like we don't have, you think about like an impression that's been made in concrete.
Right. Or like a fossil, right? The dinosaur disappears, but the impression is left over. Right.
And that the podcast itself potentially might be totally ephemeral, right? Maybe nobody's going to put it on a SanDisk MP3 player that gets rediscovered, that has the technology for earpieces, the way that right now digital archivists are having all kinds of issues with the fact that even the USB ports are changing every 5 minutes. How do we continue to access the things that are made in this period of time? And I'm finding myself really wondering about this question of how do we trace those impacts how do we see the imprint or the fossil in the world around us? And it might not necessarily be a one-to-one relationship between, oh, somebody listened to Judaism Unbound and then like went off and did this thing that we see as being a very unbound Jewish act. But when I think about the ways that I would want to use this archive, both for it to become materials that allow people to study in a meta sense what Judaism is, does, and can become. I think the thing that Lex and I were both talking about, how you, Dan, have this superpower of really, really allowing people to feel empowered to proliferate all kinds of Jewish questions and all kinds of Jewish practice, that I want people to be able to listen to this archive and continue to glean that gem. And I'm also really curious about the ways that these 10 years of interviews are also a real snapshot about what being Jewish for the last 10 years was.
Yeah.
This podcast is not only at a transition point, but we're at a pretty serious transition point in the history of the United States. I think it's actually, we're at a real global transition point. An archive of discussions about the way that Jewish life is shifting and changing from a lens that's actually about trying to proliferate something that goes beyond just the thing that was inherited is one of the most amazing historical documents I can think of for Jewish thinkers and scholars who will be looking back on this 100, 200 years hence. And what are the ways in which they might trace back the Judaisms that they've inherited to this moment and to this kind of innovative thinking? That feels like that's the impression, or that's the fossil or the handprint that might actually make it into the Lador Vador, the intergeneration.
As I'm reflecting on your question, I'm realizing that one value, I think, of holding on to the archive of the process of discovering that new or those new ways to be Jewish could hopefully be valuable in, let's say, 1,000 years to people that are going through another rupture. In the same way that B'nai Lappi talks about the value of the Talmud for us today as a record of the rabbis going through their rupture, figuring out not what's the Judaism that they figured out, but what was the process of how they figured out how to transition to a new form of Judaism. They didn't get depressed. They didn't throw up their hands. They didn't do something completely unrelated. You know, they had a certain process. And something that B'nai and I have talked about is that they had a process of thinking, and they also had a process of communication. Those were not necessarily the same. They didn't always communicate to everybody how they got there. They might have come up with a different story about how they got there that was not the real story, because that actually gives people this sense of connectivity that's really important. And there's all kinds of things that you can learn from reading the Talmud, especially reading the Talmud through B'nai's lens. But you wouldn't be able to read the Talmud through B'nai's lens if the Talmud didn't exist, like if there had been no archive. And so in that sense, yeah, like if this could somehow be valuable to a future generation that was going through a similar rupture in the Judaism that I guess hopefully, right, we will have produced, and hopefully that'll last for a while, or the Judaisms that we will produce will last for a while, but eventually they will rupture because they always do, or as B'nai says, they always crash, that we will have left something that will help those people figure out how to deal with that rupture and how to, for example, you know, say, let's let 1,000 flowers bloom. Let's think of it as art. Let's do all these things that are helpful to landing the ship on the other side, the ship of Theseus. That would be exciting. You know, for me personally, I get that for academic historians, this is a thing. Like for me personally, the record of this period on its own, that doesn't matter to me. You know, what matters to me is if it helps people in the future to navigate whatever it is that they might be going through.
Wow. So that's the pause point for this conversation. It's not a stop point. We really are excited to receive your wisdom on this. As we close, just on that rupture point, may we be useful to folks in centuries or millennia. We were talking about that period of exile earlier that we don't have a ton of records of historically. In Apocryphest this year, our Hanukkah initiative where we read books that were not canonized but which have been important to Jewish groups, we read 4 Ezra, the number 4 Ezra, which there's some scholarly debate about this, but which is likely a piece of literature written after the destruction of the Second Temple that is using the period after the destruction of the First Temple, many hundreds of years before, associated with Ezra. That's that exile time that you were referring to. They're using that time period to understand their own recent destruction in their own world. the way you're talking about how maybe we can serve that role for the future, I do think it's realistic. And I think it's something we can hope for. If you're listening to this in 500 years, 1,000 years, you have our permission to channel this in whatever ways will benefit the world most. We're going to close things out. We really appreciate any and all notes that you send our way. Facebook, Instagram, email us, dan@judaismunbound.com, lex@judaismunbound.com, and Rena Yehuda, RENAYEHUDA @judaismunbound.com. Join our Discord server at discord.judaismunbound.com, where we'll be having many conversations about this transitional moment. Be part of our work in all the ways you feel called. Head to judaismunbound.com/classes for info about the courses that we just announced that I mentioned at our announcements at the beginning. Thank you for all that you have been to Judaism Unbound these first 10 years, and all that you will be in the next stage of this exchange zone, this baton pass. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.